Okay, so
Storck, I love you. You're my favorite teacher. Bye.
hi everybody. I apologize for the delay in getting things started. I had to go get a hold of some practice tests for the practice exam this weekend. Obligatory promo, that is at noon in the lecture hall on Saturday if you want to attend. Now that I've caught my breath for a second, let's just jump right into a tutorial. I want to, with this lecture, I want to build a little bit on what I was doing last week. If you were here last Thursday, I talked some about the economic philosophies of mercantilism and capitalism. And I will review those really quickly, just so that you can get the points of those as well. I believe I do have that in this PowerPoint here. But my goal with focusing as much as I am on these economic revolutions, as I'm calling them, is I don't necessarily want to say this economic system is right or this one is right. You can argue about capitalism versus socialism all day, but I think it has a lot of practical purposes. For one thing, if you're gonna, when you're talking about like modern day politics, when words like socialism get used and capitalism gets used, it helps to know what those things actually are so you can tell when people are using them correctly and you can argue with people. But also, it helps for studying history, because if you know what capitalism is, if you know what socialism is, if you know what Marxism is, you understand better why people do things if you understand how they view the world. Because if people view the world a certain way, they're going to make their actions based on that point of view. So I'm going to review what mercantilism and capitalism are really quickly, because it's important to understanding Marxism, but I'm going to address what that philosophy is and show how it connects to the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution is itself kind of a crazy time, so it should be hopefully pretty interesting. I'll see how much I can get through today, and if we start running over time, I'll probably finish it up on Monday. But before anything else, I want to talk a little bit about the distinction between socialism and communism, because the terms sort of get used sometimes interchangeably, and I want to clarify a little bit about the difference between the two. What you'll see is that in socialism and communism share a kind of central idea that the economy should be controlled by society, whether directly or through the government. There is going to be some overlap between socialism and communism, but one of the biggest distinctions, I think, is that socialism is an economic system and communism is a political system. There's some overlap there. Socialism is a way of running your economy that communism is in some ways like a political system that includes a socialist economy. Communists this is very, very broad, and there are people who have written long, extensive books about what all of these things mean, but generally communism is more extreme. They tend to believe, communist groups tend to believe more that while socialists think you can sort of get an ideal society gradually over time, communists tend to be a little bit more direct and to the point, and sometimes you have to overthrow a few governments to get the social order that you want. So, I'm still just catching my breath from running around all day. It has been a crazy time. Okay, so I want to recap for a second. History of economic thought in the Western world. This is all of my lecture from last week distilled down into one slide. So if you want to know more about either of these philosophies and you weren't here, check out this lecture from last Thursday. These are going to be two of the big economic philosophies that define what I'm broadly construing as the West. So Europe, the parts of the Americas that are controlled by Europe, just the West in general. The first of these is going to be a system called mercantilism, which is especially prominent during the 1450s to the 1750s. That's going to be the early modern period of history as the AP exam defines it. And mercantilism is the idea, essentially, that the more gold you have and the more silver you have, the more wealth and power you have. So mercantilists are going to be very, very focused, and all of their other ideas spring from this central concept that the more gold you have, the more powerful you are. Mercantilists are going to pursue a positive balance of trade. If you think about this, if you trade with somebody else and you are trying to get stuff from other countries, if you think about it like in the DBQ for the silver trade, when China trades, if you go to China and you want to get silk or porcelain, you have to give them silver. So you're losing silver and China's gaining silver, which means if the more silver you have, the more powerful you are. That's a bad thing. So mercantilists are always going to want you to export more things, sell more stuff to other people than you buy from other people. That way you have more gold. Similarly, they want you to strictly regulate your economy, make rules about who can trade with who, to make sure that you get as much gold and silver as possible. And they believe that trade is a zero-sum game. That's basically the idea that there are going to be winners and losers whenever people are trading with each other. I think that also pretty clearly ties into gold equals power, because if you're trading, somebody's getting gold and somebody's losing gold. Mercantilism. Over time, the idea of mercantilism is questioned by various groups and philosophers, including the physiocrats, and it leads to a system called capitalism in the end, as summarized by Adam Smith in a very, very long book called The Wealth of Nations. And capitalism is, in many ways, it disagrees about how the world works based on mercantilism. According to a capitalist, when societies trade, everyone gains, everyone gets better. There are not winners and losers. Similarly, capitalists say that people will naturally seek profit. People always try to maximize the amount of profit and gains they get in society from whatever they do, which means it's good to let people compete with each other. You should let people make whatever they want to make and sell whatever they want to sell, and everything will work out.
Sorry to interrupt. Did you get what you needed?
I got it figured out, yes. So.
Okay, and I have a way to get in wherever I need to go on Saturday now.
Okay.
Okay. And
Perfect.
then I'll talk to you about the other part later.
Sounds good. Capitalism is distinguished from mercantilism in that whereas mercantilism is very, very hands-on because you want to get as much gold as possible, in capitalism, it tends to be more hands-off. It has this idea that markets and economies will regulate themselves. Last time I talked about this as being like an invisible hand. If you let everybody sell whatever they want to sell and let people buy whatever they want to buy, people will get the things that they want and need. Because of this, capitalists are going to advocate very little government regulation. They want people to be hands-off from messing with the economy. The economic term for that is laissez-faire, which means, truly, kind of, I believe, I don't remember the exact translation, but it basically means hands-off. The term laissez-faire actually comes from the Taoist term wu wei, which is like the idea that you don't want to go against the flow of nature. But a French guy stole it and then gave it to Adam Smith. Mercantilism and capitalism, you can see the influence of them on various phenomena throughout history. Mercantilism is going to be the philosophy behind the economic and political competition of a lot of the kingdoms of Western Europe from about the 1450s onward. You can think of this as around the time that these Western European kingdoms start exploring the world. They make contact with the Americas and start colonizing. And you'll see a lot of their actions can be understood through a mercantilist lens. The way these countries see it, the more gold and silver they have, the more power they have. So they see themselves as in competition with each other, sometimes going so far as to fight a whole bunch of wars about it. Mercantilism is also the motivating factor behind why these kingdoms explore and colonize the Americas, because frankly, if you have colonies, it's a new source for gold and silver and materials you can use to make things to sell for gold and silver. Capitalism is definitely more commonly practiced today than mercantilism. It underpins everything from the Industrial Revolution, which sort of in many ways the growth of modern production, which is something that we'll do a whole nother tutorial about. It's the rise and fall of the British Empire, the growth of the United States. It ultimately underpins the Cold War, imperialism. I'm not expecting you to necessarily know what these things are yet, but we will address them between now and the AP exam. If you want to just know for now that capitalism is the way that the Western world views economics nowadays, basically from after mercantilism until now, that's kind of what you need to know for today's lecture. This is the way that the West views the world. Europe, America, etc.
Wait, aren't like some European countries socialist though?
Some Western European countries are more socialist for sure. You won't see a lot of purely socialist governments. Just like today, you're really not going to see any pure communist governments. Most governments that exist incorporate some kind of mix of capitalism and socialism. Like even in the more communist countries, you're still going to see over time, like China, for example, was super, super communist at first, but then they start kind of allowing more free market capitalism to happen sometimes, in some cases. And even like the socialist countries of Western Europe are going to be have some socialist elements and some free element markets. So it's usually like on a spectrum between each other. Okay. So now I want to talk about Marxism. This is Karl Marx. He has a really great beard. I like it. He has good taste in beards. I feel like you're actually required to grow a beard before you get a history degree. It's one of the prerequisites.
Well, you can't grow a beard.
You gotta find one.
Sorry.
Yeah. Get like a beard wig. Yeah.
Sorry.
Pick a different major. Sorry.
I will prove you wrong.
Just like take yours.
So Marxism is an economic philosophy that rises in the late 1800s. And I think it's helpful to understand some of the things that have happened in the world in the late 1800s as the result of capitalism in some ways. By the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution will have kicked in, and like Britain, Germany, and then later Germany and the United States will become some of the world's biggest economic powers. And in a lot of ways, you're going to see people starting to feel the negative effects of capitalism over time. Over the course of the Industrial Revolution, people start shifting away from their traditional agricultural economies and moving more towards industrialization, factories, mass production. And as this happens, you'll see in this transition over time that people move away from traditional agriculture-based economies and ways of living and start working in factories and living in cities. And because of that transition, you're going to see some people, especially in the working classes, kind of, from their perspective, lose out in the system. Like, there are going to be societies around the world that are going to get super, super rich from sort of increasing industrial production and following kind of capitalist ideas. But the poor and working classes are oftentimes now, you've gone from like living on a farm and producing things for subsistence and to sell for a little bit of profit to working in a factory somewhere and living in a really, really grimy city with terrible sanitation conditions and packed into rooms with a bunch of people. And you'll see that as a result, some, especially around the world in working class areas, the idea of Marxism will start taking hold as kind of a, how do I put it, like a counter to capitalism. They'll say, we don't really like how the economy works right now, let's try something else. And I think if you keep that in mind, especially once I start talking about Russia here, you'll see why they find Marxism kind of appealing. So, let's see. Yeah, we'll start here. So, Karl Marx is a German journalist and philosopher who writes two really, really famous books. One is called it's called Capital. The other one is called The Communist Manifesto. And he draws on a lot of ideas from the Enlightenment and comes up with this idea about how the world works that is in many ways kind of a response to a disagreement with capitalism. And according to Marx, all of history is defined by struggle between classes. He says that all throughout history, you can look at all of the different social and economic orders that have existed, and that you can break them down into the common people versus their masters. So you're going to have the people who have the power, the people who don't have the power, and they're going to be in conflict with each other. And he says that you can distill all previous class structures in society into that, basically. According to Marx, eventually the working class is going to overthrow the owner class. And I think before I detail a little bit more about this, I want to tell you what those classes are. So I'm going to give you just a second if you want to finish copying this down, and then I'm going to click away from it. So after the rest of my explanation, I think it'll make more sense. Okay, so according to Marx, sorry, my PowerPoint is breaking a bunch all of a sudden. According to Marx, there's a couple different classes in society, in a capitalist system. The people at the top are the bourgeoisie. They are the business owners, the upper class. The key thing to know about the bourgeoisie in Marxism is that they own the means of production. The means of production are going to be the facilities, the things that you use to make stuff, to produce economic goods, factories, any sort of, really anything that you use to produce something else to sell is a means of production. So you have the bourgeoisie at the top of society, a very, very small amount of people. And below them, you'll have the proletariat, who are, frankly, everybody else. Since they don't own factories, the facilities you use to produce goods, all they have left that they can use to sell is their labor. You'll see that much of Marxism is focused on labor as being the source of value in society. And so Marx has this idea that labor is what the proletariat sells in order to earn wages. Because they don't have a factory, they've got to sell their time to somebody else. And according to Marx, the bourgeoisie and proletariat are just going to necessarily be in conflict with each other. And if you think about this, it makes kind of an intuitive sense. Like, the bourgeoisie want to, if you own a factory, if you run a business, you're going to want to make as much profit as possible. Especially according to capitalism, everybody wants to make as much profit as possible. And if you keep, like, the lower the wages of your workers are, the less money you pay the people that work for you, the more profit you make. And on the flip side, the proletariat are going to want high wages. If you work for a living, if you sell your labor to make money, you want to make as much money as possible. And so they have differing wants that are fundamentally incompatible with each other. And Marx actually also argues that the way that the business owners make a profit over time is actually extracting, like, surplus. I think he calls it surplus value out of the proletariat. For your guys' sake, you basically just need to know that the bourgeoisie profit from the labor of the workers. And over time, Marx says that this conflict is going to break out into unrest. It's going to cause strikes, rioting, where the proletariat gets mad and fights back against the bourgeoisie. And in the end, what this is going to lead to is this stuff down here. Essentially, the working class eventually, inevitably, according to Marx, is going to get sick of this system and overthrow it. The working class is going to be responsible for holding a revolution and overthrowing the owners and building a new state, a new economic system where the workers control things and the workers make the decisions. In this new state, after you'll hear that Marxists always talk about wanting to seize the means of production. That's this. Basically, the workers are going to take all of these factories, take control of all of that stuff from the owner's class, and now the workers are going to decide how that's used. As part of this new system, according to Marxists, you're going to get rid of private property. And in the group that's going to decide what you produce and when you produce it is going to be the proletariat, the workers. You're going to create these workers' councils that run the factories, make the decisions about what to make and who to make it for. And the idea, at least according to Marx, is that these workers will produce things not based on making a profit, but based on meeting the needs of everyone. So society will, instead of it being like an economic system based around everybody selling whatever they want and trying to make as much profit as possible, you have these worker councils that are going to make the decisions and produce the things that everybody needs. The wrench that kind of gets thrown into the system then is that sounds nice in theory, but what if the what if the workers' councils don't actually, do that? What if they just try to get power for themselves, like people often do in the real world?
Human nature.
Yeah, like what happens? This sounds great, but what about if human nature happens? And I think human nature is going to be a thing that happens during the Russian Revolution because
and pretty much everything else.
And pretty much everything else. There is no I don't know, I believe all of the communist states that have popped up in like the 1900s on have all kind of fallen victim to not doing this, basically. You'll see that anytime a communist state gets started, at least in the big examples of like Soviet Russia, communist China, oftentimes they don't actually really apply Marx's ideas the way Marx intended them to. So you'll still see nowadays there are people in the social sciences who operate from a Marxist viewpoint. They work off of Marx's ideas and use it as a way to view the world. If you want to get into a fight with some social scientists, argue with them about capitalism versus Marxism. It's a great way to get that started.
Wait, that's cool and all, but like, wouldn't the worker councils end up being the new bourgeoisie? Isn't that how that works?
Hypothetically, well, okay, so Marx says no, because they're going to work for the best interests of everybody. But that depends on the workers' councils actually working in the best interests of everybody.
Human nature kicks
yeah.
in and
To kind of draw on that point about whether or not human nature would allow for this, according to Marx, he actually says that all of these changes are going to need to happen very gradually over time. And that's a key point. He says basically, you can't have a revolution and overthrow the capitalist order until capitalism becomes so developed that you get a clear proletariat, a clear working class that's super, super fed up with the system and like is ready to overthrow things. Revolutionaries will often not agree with that. They'll kind of look at Marx and say, how about we do it right now? Because we don't like how the social order is treating us right now. We are still poor and hungry and have no money. So everything sucks right now. Let's just speed along the process a little bit. You'll actually see that in response to Marxism, you'll see a lot of early anarchist movements pop up, especially in areas like Russia in the late 1800s, of like anarchist movements who are like, no, we just really need to overthrow the government right now because conditions are that bad. Okay, so that's sort of the economic side of things. I want to take all of this abstract economic thought that I've been talking about so far in these past couple of lectures and start kind of applying it to stuff in history. And I will continue to do that through some of these next lectures and tutorials and so on, especially when we get to the Industrial Revolution. I'll pick back up on capitalism. But I want to talk a little bit about the Russian Revolution. And in order to do this, I think you'll see that the Russian Revolution offers it offers an illustration of why Marxist ideas can be appealing to groups in history. Because in particular, if you examine what Russia looks like before the Russian Revolution breaks out, you can see why some of Marx's ideas might be appealing, I guess is how I'd put it. Because broadly speaking, pre-revolutionary Russia is not such a nice place to live. By the beginning of the 1900s, it's the only true autocracy left in Europe. It's the only remaining nation that centralizes all of its power. There's no type of representative political institutions. You'll see pretty much at this point, everybody else in Europe has moved in some way towards allowing their people some sort of voice in government, various kind of democratic ideas. But Russia is still just doing the autocratic thing. They're sticking to that. You still have a Tsar, a ruler, a monarch who has unlimited power to make decisions in society. One of Velocida, Nicholas II, in 1884, is the last ruler of the Romanov dynasty that got started all the way back during our lecture about the rise of Russia. After, I believe it was Ivan the Terrible. And Nicholas II is it sort of typifies what Tsars are like in Russia, because he believes he's the absolute royal ruler anointed by God, and he has all the say in what is going on. Over time, you'll really see that Russia has sort of fallen behind the rest of the Western world in a lot of ways. They get into a couple of wars that really show how backwards they are in terms of their technological capacity and their military capacity. If you look at how the common people in particular are treated in Russia, a little bit before this, in 1860, around the 1860s, one of the previous Tsars, Alexander II, emancipates the serfs. And if you'll think back to when we lectured about Russia previously, For a long, long time in Russia, you've had this economic system with a few really rich landowners and a bunch of lower class people who work that land. And the serfs are essentially forced by law to work the land. It is fundamentally not that different from slavery. And by the 1860s, there's really only two countries or nations in the Western world that are still practicing that much forced labor. One of them is Russia. What's the other one? In like the 1860s?
U.S.
The U.S., yeah. But by this time, everybody else has kind of given up on the forced labor thing, except for Russia and the United States. And then the whole Civil War happens in America. But I digress. Tsar Alexander II does emancipate the serfs. He does free them from being forced to work the land. They're now allowed to own property and like marry the people of their choosing. But immediately after that, the Russian government turns around and requires all of these Tsars who are now free to start paying back the government for all of the land that they just gave them. So now, instead of just like being forced to work the land and being poor and hungry, now they have their freedom, but they're still poor and hungry. And don't really own the land because they're still paying it off. So in short, things are bad. And in particular, you have a very, very large lower class in poor economic conditions that are not currently happy with the social order. And when they start hearing about ideas like Marxist ideology that says the lower class will rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, they hear that idea and they're like, that sounds pretty cool. Let's try it. And the thing that really causes the Russian Revolution to come to a head is World War I. And World War I, in and of itself, is a very complicated topic. If you try to trace all of the reasons why World War I got started, it's a whole bunch of alliances between certain people and other people. And we'll talk about all of that later, specifically when we discuss World War I.
It was the serfs.
But I want to focus in on what it was like for Russia fighting in World War I, which, again, it was really an unpleasant time. Russia essentially goes through some very, very poor conditions when they're fighting in World War I. Although they have the largest army in the world, they have very, very incompetent generals and almost no supplies whatsoever. All of this leads to very, very low soldier morale, which happens when you only have like one rifle for every 3 soldiers. And your military commander's strategy for fighting the war is saying, just run into the machine guns. They'll run out of bullets eventually. It's not very effective, and a whole lot of people die. Like millions and millions of Russians die in World War I. So as they're running out of food, running out of weapons, and as morale in the Russian army is at like its lowest, the Russian civilians at home are also not having a good time. Supplies and food are being funneled into the war effort, which they're losing, so people are starving back at home as well. And there's just widespread shortages of food and fuel all around Russia, in especially the winter of 1916 and 1917. You actually hit this point where women especially are having to line up before dawn at grocery stores in order to get rations of food from the government. On a side note, I want to talk for a second about a holiday that you may have heard about last month, around March 8th, International Women's Day. International Women's Day actually got started in Russia, and over time in various countries that like practice it, it's kind of, they've dropped some of the original title. But International Women's Day actually originated as International Working Women's Day, and it dates back to this revolution in Russia in like 1917, because over time, after as this really, really horrible war is going on on the Russian front, you'll start seeing that around March 8th, women start holding like these mass riots and strikes and demonstrations all around Russia, because they're sick of having to line up and wait for these bread rations. They start yelling peace and bread and down with the aristocracy, and everything is bad. And eventually, later on down the line, it gets remembered as International Working Women's Day, and then just becomes International Women's Day down the line. So the end result is, in response to these riots, the Russian government actually tries to send in essentially the Tsar's military police, the Cossacks, to stop the riots. And the military police just join in the riot because they think everything is just that bad. It's really not good. They're having a terrible time. So the Tsar gets more and more unpopular, and like even like more unpopular than he used to be. And I have to take a side tangent to talk about some shenanigans involving Nicholas II. So Nicholas II was the Tsar, and his wife was Alexandra, who was, I believe, from a German kingdom. And because of all of these economic problems of like poverty and shortages and a horribly mismanaged war, they go from being unpopular to being even less popular because of their political incompetence. They rely heavily on the guidance of this man who claims to be a mystic healer named Rasputin, which causes Russia as a whole to kind of make fun of them because they look really silly. The reason for their reliance on this guy who claims to have mystical healing powers is their son has hemophilia. He has a blood condition. And Alexander gets this idea that Rasputin is the only person, his mystical powers are the only thing that can like cure their son of this disease. I think I have a picture of Rasputin on the next slide. Yeah. So, pretty intense dude. He's built up this really bad reputation in St. Petersburg over time. He's an alcoholic, he's slept around a bunch. And the Tsar and his wife's reliance on this guy becomes essentially a symbol of the Tsar's incompetence as a ruler. That's Alexis. That's Alexander's son. He has hemophilia. So, because Rasputin is essentially embarrassing the Tsar to the point where it's just inspiring less and less allegiance to him, the aristocracy actually tries to have the Tsar's relatives try to have Rasputin assassinated, and they try 3 times, and it takes until the 3rd attempt for it to finally work.
So did he actually have?
Say that again?
So was he actually a mystical monk?
I mean, you never know. Maybe he has mystical powers. They tried to serve him cake laced with cyanide. It doesn't work. He survives the cyanide. They shoot him a few times. He stays alive, wounded and bleeding, and just walks it off. Like, that's fine. It's whatever. And finally, what actually does him in is the men push his body through a hole in a river that's iced over. And supposedly he moved around for a few minutes before dying. Just tried to walk off the ice. But finally he dies. What a guy. But the death of Rasputin is not enough to sort of save the Tsar's reputation. Because as all of these riots are happening, you have decreasing morale from the soldiers fighting in the war, you have all of these shortages and riots at home, and it all kind of comes to a head when ultimately the Tsar ends up abdicating the throne. This happens during an event known as the March Revolution of 1917, when these strikes and protests get organized. As I said before, the Tsar's military police are sent in to stop the protesters, and the soldiers just end up joining in. The Tsar tries to get the army to listen to him, and at this point, nobody does. So he bails. He abdicates the throne. He gives up his power. It ends the Romanov dynasty that's lasted for 300 years. And all of a sudden, there's this huge, huge power vacuum. Okay, so this is not something that's up on the PowerPoint slide, but it's something that I want you to get in your notes if you are taking notes. Around this time, we no longer have a Tsar, we no longer have a central ruler, and you'll see that around Russia, you'll see these kind of local councils that get started, full of soldiers and striking workers that band together to take over the factories and take over the barracks and sort of take over the infrastructure of society in lieu of the absence of the Tsar's power. These groups become known as Soviets, councils. And you can see where this is going. So while there's no central power, these Soviets, these local workers' councils, start taking over the factories and start taking over the barracks. in many ways, these Soviets represent the more radical interests of the lower classes. I think it's important to emphasize that, like, not everybody in the lower classes in Russia at this time period were this level of radical. Some of them were just poor and hungry and very sad about it and very angry about it. But within these Soviets, you start seeing some radical leftist groups start up that believe in various branches of socialism or Marxist theory. In particular, there's a group called the Bolsheviks who get started out of one of these Soviets. And I'll talk more about the Bolsheviks later because they become important. But for the time being, the group that steps in to fill in the absence of the Tsar is a provisional government, a temporary central government created by Alexander Kerensky. It's the government that takes over after the Tsar steps down, and it's like, it's a stopgap measure, really. They still see, when they're kind of evaluating the current situation in Russia, they see all of this poverty and strife on the homeland and this war. They decide to focus on the war effort, and it makes the provisional government unpopular almost immediately. The Russian masses want peace and for Russia to withdraw from World War I, and the more radical elements want like transfer of the means of production to the workers. The government listens to none of these concerns and is like, let's do it. Let's just continue fighting the war. And you get into this point of time for a few months where there's this like tug of war between this provisional government that a lot of people in the lower classes don't like and these councils that the lower classes have started over who really like has the power.
Is this kind of like an early union?
Say that again?
Is this kind of like a labor union-ish?
Kind of. I think you can definitely see some parallels between this and this and labor unions. You'll see that it's not necessarily Marxism, but there are socialist ideas do become popular in like labor unions, especially the ones that rise up in like America and some of Western Europe in the late 1800s. For a while, you'll actually say that there's also a pretty active communist party in America too.
And then they all get killed or something?
Yeah, there's the Red Terror.
Yeah, for a while, communism becomes pretty politically unpopular in America. Around the time of the Cold War, we try to snuff that out.
There's someone stamping really hard on it.
That's true.
What was his name? What's that guy?
Oh, you're thinking of McCarthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Red Terror.
McCarthy is an American politician who essentially sort of leads like a witch hunt where he accuses a bunch of people in the public eye to be communists. And it's really, a lot of it is scare tactics, but it's pretty effective in making people kind of step away from communism.
Pretty nasty too.
Pretty nasty guy. So with the provisional government, the masses want peace and withdrawal. They want transfer of land to the peasants. They want control of the factories by workers. And the provisional government does none of those things. They do not enact any social reforms. They do not pull Russia out of the war. They want to try to finish off World War I. It causes the provisional government to lose a bunch of popularity and ultimately leads the provisional government to weaken and lose power. So we're back to having a power vacuum. Again.
What's with all the power vacuums?
It happens.
When you decapitate society.
The problem too now is, now we've lost a Tsar and we've really lost any sort of central government, which means, crucially, the Tsar no longer has the Cossacks, those military police that he tried to use to sort of get the riots and strikes under control. And now that there's no military police to kind of suppress dissent, you'll start seeing some other groups show up. Some of the more radical groups will come a little bit more out of the woodwork. Oh. And this is where you see the Bolsheviks get a lot of popularity. They start off as one of these Soviets, one of these workers' councils. They're a radical revolutionary group in Russia. They're led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin. Their big slogan is peace, land, and bread, which you'll see recur several times in this lecture. So Lenin is very radical. He's a son of a government official who actually at one point tries to stage a revolution where he tries to execute and kill the Tsar. Doesn't work. So he spends a bunch of time in Siberia and Switzerland in exile. And when he makes his way back into Russia, Lenin's goal with the Bolsheviks is he draws on a lot of Marx's ideas, because you can see, like, I think it makes a sort of sense that these lower classes, that in the absence of all of this power, after all of the stuff that's been happening with the social order in Russia and with the conditions and strikes in World War I, that there would be radical groups that pop up that get interested in things like Marxism. And the Bolsheviks are going to draw on a lot of Marxist ideology. They're going to say, yes, let's overthrow the social order and seize the means of production. But the key point is that Lenin kind of breaks away from Marx's ideas, in that Marx very much advocates for transforming the social order gradually over time. And Lenin is like, no, instead of just waiting for the revolution, we're going to create a party that will lead the revolution. At one point, Lenin says, the will of a class is sometimes fulfilled by a dictator. He actually goes on to say that Soviet socialist democracy is not the least incompatible with individual rule and dictatorship. So he doesn't, like, he sees, and the Bolsheviks see, that you can bring about a Marxist society while still having a dictator who can step in and kind of take power and, like, make the change happen now, as opposed to waiting for it to happen over time. So over time, the Bolsheviks get more and more support among the workers and the soldiers in Russia. And it leads to what many people will actually call the Russian Revolution. Sometimes it's referred to as the Bolshevik Revolution, because it's the Bolsheviks who are leading it. You might also hear it called the October Revolution. So in the Russian Revolution itself, the Bolsheviks and their followers staged this coup d'etat in St. Petersburg. They overthrow the provisional government, and it's really a pretty bloodless revolution. Most people who still work for the provisional government either flee or are arrested. It's very sudden. And it freaks out a lot of the rival revolutionary groups who sort of believe that who have talked a lot about, like, bringing about a socialist state in Russia or bringing about some kind of revolution, but believe that it could only happen after years of time. But Lenin cares more about immediate change and grabbing power than he does about, like, the fine points of Marxist theory. And the Bolsheviks claim absolute power. So we've gone from a Tsar to this little provisional government to another group claiming absolute power. It's just that now it's radicals who claim to represent the working class. And I think because it's 5:10 that I want to stop here, because I feel like it's a pretty good breaking point. It's nice. A lot of stuff happens in Russia in 1917. There's so many revolutions, we have to start naming them after the months in which they happen. But I guess the thing that I want to draw back to conclude, the thing that I've kind of been trying to harken back to, is that I think you can see a lot of parallels. And it's an example in which you can see that a lot of these actions come about in part because of historical circumstance. I think these revolutions happen in part because World War I works as like a catalyst. It makes situations just bad enough that people will riot and overthrow the Tsar. But you can see how it makes sense, like, given what's going on in society, why people would be attracted to certain economic philosophies. People are going to think the way they do for a reason, I guess, is a closing point. Another closing point, if you're going to try to kill Rasputin anytime soon, you got to do it like 3 times. So.
Oh, darn. Is
Okay.
it Putin named Rasputin?
So I'll pick back up with at this point on Monday, because there's a little bit more stuff I want to talk about with the Russian Revolution before we wrap up here.